Okay, so my talk today is called 3 Times a Woman, and I did almost, at one point I did attach a little musical file, and then I would begin it without playing. So let's not do that, but maybe I'll try next time. A gendered economy of stem cell innovation. So I'm going to say just a little bit about what's in this forthcoming book, but hope then that the talk has legs of its own, because body parts. And in this book, I spell out something I call a procurial economy, which has 3 parts to it, as I see. And it's basically, how do you sell to, in this case, the members of the general public of California, the idea that they ought directly to vote for a particular kind of science that is both ethically problematic and for which there is actual or perceived shortfall of funding at the federal level. And that was the 2004 Proposition 71, which was the California Stem Cell Research and Cures Act. And as I talk about it in the book, and it may or may not be accurate, but I pull out 3 kinds of things that I see as being key to this package. And the first and single most important one I maintain is this pro-cures rhetoric. This idea that what you're doing is voting for cures. And absolutely vital to that is the moral imperative, the idea that nobody could possibly be against that. So it starts with "we the people of California" and goes on to say all these things, that all these conditions that we, 70+ conditions that we or people we know and love might already or might someday suffer from. And so it sets it up as something that, of course, you'll want to support this. There's and that actually has a very old, quite an old genealogy, that idea that what you're doing with biomedical research is paying for cures. It's also key to that, the idea that there's kind of a trickle-down economy that I will return to later, that will create it'll create jobs, it'll create things that can be intellectual property that can be sold and so on. But I'll return to the question of the trickle-down economy later. But behind this idea of cures is something that deserves to be unpacked, I think, which is all the critiques that have been made in various subfields against the idea of cures, in particular critical disability justice studies, where the idea that particular conditions can be or even should be cured is always at the very least troubled. So it's a notion that many parts of the population living here, in some sense, already know is problematic. Do we really think that people with debilitating chronic conditions could reach or would reach some moment or point of cure? When we actually think about how much do we believe in that, and yet it still carries this moral imperative. Part of the pro-cures as well is to kind of corral and organize the embryo politics that's behind the opposition to stem cell research, so that you have a moral template or a moral narrative that can be put against the ethical, and that there is a distinction between those words, moral and ethical. One is used more by the Democrats and pro-science, and the other, that's moral, and ethical is used more by those who are engaged in the embryo politics debate. The pro-cures rhetoric can be trumped by embryo politics and is in some populations, but at least it gives you this framing that gives an ethical imperative to counter that with. Also key to this what I've called a procurial economy, is the idea that you can operationalize, you can have science as normal, you can do science as normal, even though it's really problematic, and even though there are many people in the state who don't want you to do it, because by turning that objection into something really particular. So what happens is that all the ethical legislation doesn't just carry on arguing about these either utilitarian or deontological arguments about whether or not it's okay to use embryos to get stem cells. It turns into which pluripotent stem cell lines may we do research on, and so you kind of off-stage the embryo politics debate itself, and the term that arises over the first few years after the passage of Proposition 71 is this notion of acceptable derivation. So a stem cell line that has been acceptably derived from the right place under the right conditions. I'll return to what those are, but basically it can be a research, it can be an egg donated for research explicitly, or it can be an embryo left over, so-called. There's a lot of politics around that expression too, from the process of IVF or in vitro fertilization. So as long as it's in the proposition itself that it's okay to use those products, those bits of bodies, those bits of reproduction, then what the ethics does is it makes sure that it's ethically derived, make sure that it does come from those places. Over the first few years, there's also various countries' provisions of material, of pluripotent material gets grandfathered in. Oh, in the UK, they do it well enough. In Japan, they do it well enough. So it starts getting written in country by country that we can also accept their standards. That will be good enough for acceptable derivation. Also key to this complex, I argue, is the development of an incredible set of additional bureaucracies, which I refer to as part of what I think of as a rising sector of the bioinnovation complex, which is biocuration. And that's bioinformatics, it's data curation, but it's also biobanking, and it's also custody tracking. It's chains of custody, it's biomaterials, material transfer agreement, and these ethical protocols that make sure that you got it from the right place and you do the right thing with it, and you don't use federally funded Petri dishes to put your non-federally approved stem cell lines in and all the rest of it. So this bureaucracy of biocuration, which is this larger phenomenon. It just happens to, they all seem to have this route of curing, which I'm sure if I was Rachel I could do something very clever with, but anyway. So in the rest of the talk, so that's kind of the background. In the rest of this talk I'm going to talk about women, some women, sometimes differentiated, sometimes not, as voters, carers, funders, advocates, donators of body labour and body parts, and as buyers of face cream, and the ways that they figure in what ends up happening after the passage of the 2004 Stem Cell Research and Cures Act. So just a little bit more background on kind of the stakes of this. Why does any of this matter? So for today at least, I'm going to kind of buy the federal model of the social contract with science, and I'm not sure it's right to do that, but I'm going to. So what happens when public funding of scientific research moves from the federal to the state level is an implicit question I'm asking behind this talk today. And why would it matter to anyone in this room? You're probably not science policy people, but we live in an innovation economy in all kinds of important senses, I would argue. That the funding of science, the idea that it's an engine of economic growth, the ways in which California in particular states its own exceptionalism and its relations with other parts of the country and other parts of the world really is narrated in these terms, and its products and our obligations to engage as consumers, to be prosthetized and hybridized with its products as in terms of our bodies and our identities, and our obligations to engage in not only in the knowledge we produce, but in the ways in which we produce knowledge, I would argue is so pervasive that it's actually of interest to all of us. Of course, I would argue that. So the contract with science at the federal level, there are not many that aspects of it I'm going to pull out here, but the basic understanding is that funding basic science is good for the economy, the knowledge economy, but it's good for the economy in general. You produce jobs, you make things that improve lives, that decrease morbidity and increase life expectancy and increase the quality of life, that you gain in global competition, both in terms of symbolic capital and actual capital, and so on and so forth. And each one of you will be absolutely aware of what that idea, that kind of assumption And it takes quite a lot to even put yourself in a place where you question it. You know, is it true that that funding basic science is good for us, or whatever that might mean? And also that the results of research themselves will be incredibly interesting. I actually kind of agree. So it's not that I'm questioning this, but I just want to kind of lay the assumptions out there that the results of the research itself will be interesting, exciting, and will move human history forward, as well as produce new kinds of social and economic activity. The trickle-down economics model then is the one that it not only produces jobs in the first place, but it produces goods that can be exported. It increases, that can also be then bought by us with any expendable capital we have, so that again we're returning tax dollars to the country. So whether or not you yourself benefit directly from the science, you're benefiting from the fact that the tax base grows and innovation grows. At the federal level, there are various quasi-firewalls in place. There are things that separate off. It's not just that we all get the chance to, so, you know, the federal government does it for it, and you vote for it, and so that's a majority, and so it's going to happen. We have these firewalls, we have these institutions, and they have a whole history unto themselves that I'm not even going to begin to talk about today. But we have the National Institutes of Health, we have the National Science Foundations, we have the Department of Energy, and so on, that are staffed by people who are experts in those fields, that the calls, even though they're not completely open, they're widely distributed across the sciences. They're called the requests for applications. You put in your grant applications, you go through peer review. So there are these, it's not a direct democracy thing. There is a firewall between the fact that your tax dollars are going to fund the research that's funded and the provision of those dollars. It's decided by supposedly experts in the science field and the peers who, in the field broadly distributed, who might be you or me. Devolving it to the state, in the case of, there are generally recognized to be three things that were extraordinary about Proposition 71 in terms of the contract between science and the state that it brought about. One was the fact that it was a direct democracy act, it was a proposition, so that people voted to fund the research. And that raises for me today as a question, so what did they vote for? What was in the rhetoric, what was in the wording of that proposition? And the fact that they voted for it, should they get that, whatever we agree that is? The second extraordinary thing about it was that the funds that the kind of funds that were voted for, these bonds from the general fund, are usually reserved for what's called bricks and mortar projects, and so it's for things like building public buildings, building bridges, fixing the Bay Bridge. It's for things like that, and that immediately puts in place a kind of idea that these are public goods in some way. And in particular, it puts in place the bricks and mortar projects put in place the idea that what's paid for is something that, in principle, is equally accessed by everyone, or at the very least, people cannot be barred from access to it. So it raises the question: if it's this kind of money, should the fruits of stem cell research funded by California taxpayers be available to everyone? Or is it okay if a biomedical research product comes onto the scene and anybody without health insurance, even if they're a taxpayer, has no or very limited access to that? So it immediately puts in question this kind of triage of who's getting the healthcare, even though because of the kind of funding that it is. And then the third extraordinary thing about it was that what this proposition did was it amended the California Constitution and the Health and Safety Code in such a way as to establish it as a California constitutional right to conduct pluripotent stem cell research, which is quite an extraordinary thing to do. If you can imagine taking something else that is extremely contested, ethically contested, like there's a constitutional right to conduct, I don't know, radioactive experiments or nuclear weapons experiments or something. It's a very, very strange thing to make into a constitutional right. The reason, of course, for that is that it makes it very hard to overturn it. So it's a kind of robustness to the populism. It needs a very large majority. It was written into the proposition that it can't be changed at all for a number of years, and so on. So it gives it this sort of political, it gives it this robustness against the embryo politics. Okay, so one time a woman. How were women, in what ways did they, in this new social contract, what ways were they enrolled? What were they supposed to be doing? What part were they supposed to be playing in this? Or did they in fact end up playing in this research? Now I'm going to use this word, bless you, this word woman with this around it, and usually when I say woman, it's because people, insofar as anybody talked about it at all, used that essentialized, deracialized, declassed concept, gender concept. And when I break it down more or specify, for example, terms separated by commas, like race, class, gender, it will be because insofar as people discuss it, they tended to do that. So already the fact that sometimes it's used as an essentialist category and sometimes it's broken down into this intersectional understanding of there being very different kinds of women contributing to this or being enrolled in this proposition in different ways, is already of some interest, I think. But in these first few slides, it's just that I've got bad data. So Proposition 71, I just wanted to put forward the idea that it's probably true, everybody says it's true, and it probably is true, that Proposition 71 was disproportionately approved because of women voters. And people certainly don't go around saying yay for women because they let us have stem cell research. You know, regenerative medicine conferences don't open with banners saying thanks to women or anything like that. You know, it's not something that people typically think of, but in fact the politics of certain kinds of science at the moment lean very democratic, and democratic at the moment, and in California since you know, at least for a couple of decades, leans very democratic. So this is a map for how people voted for Proposition 71 in November 2004. And you can see that the yes votes, it's quite, you'll see in a second, I'll show you the overlap with Democratic versus Republican, and it's not perfect by any means, but it's more than suggested. So let me move on to the next slide. So that's the breakdown. The blue states are the blue parts are the Democratic counties, and the red ones are the Republican ones. So you can see that there's quite a bit of similarity. There's a strong correlation between the two. Now, so that's just suggesting that more Democrats voted for the proposition, which it turns out, which is in fact true. It doesn't necessarily suggest that more women did. But if you look in that same election at the gender gap in voting at the national election on the same day, this is what you get. So in 2004, George W. Bush was comfortably re-elected, but it wasn't by women. Women voted for Bush 43% and for Kerry 51%. It was men who voted for Bush 55% and Kerry for 41%. So there was a bigger gap for men, so that's why Bush carried it. But women did not vote for Bush in that election. So they're disproportionately voting Democratic. So there is some way in which I think it's probably reasonable to say that they disproportionately voted, in fact, for this. I don't know that to be true, but for this proposition. Okay, so what were they voting for when they voted pro-cures? So apart from this sort of general rhetorical appeal, what might be some particular appeal to voting in favour of cures? And here I just want to point to very well documented differences, gender differentials. So there are gender differences in disability, in who has what kind of disability, in chronic disease incidence and severity, and also in resource allocation, both in children and in adults, by gender, across race and class. And then well documented at this point are the racialized, class and gender dimensions of care work, and carers for people with the conditions that are targeted in this proposition as possible ultimate beneficiaries from pursuing stem cell research are very, very, very important players in the rhetoric of pro-cures, in part through their role in patient advocacy organizations, in part through their role, sometimes more privatized than that, their roles in the family as caregivers, in their roles in fighting schools and fighting for healthcare and for other kinds of resources for children and adults that they're caring for with these conditions that are supposed to be, that are perhaps going to be one day curable by this research. Now, in myself talking to different women about whether or not they believe that they're carebirds, so talking to a lot of women who are very strong believers in this research, including ones who are also very skeptical, who might have a strong commitment to the social model of disability and believe that more resources should be given to various kinds of accessibility and mitigation of discrimination and access and participation in the full range of life activities. There's still a high level, or at least I found, a high level of enthusiasm about the idea of doing scientific research that might lead to cures for conditions of family members or the self or people that you care for with a work contract. But people seem to be, when you push them or when you try to pin them down, people are quite unsure whether the care burden itself would lessen, would increase, or would be kind of not so impacted. So a lot of people engage in what Rainer Rapp, among many others, have talked about, this sort of moral pioneership, this idea of being a gendered, situated part of a domestic economy that's pushing for resources and cures for these people with these conditions, although they're entirely unsure. So a typical thing would be someone might say, well, my son might be able to walk if this is successful. Do you mean just walk? You mean walk, or do you mean, you know, what do you mean by that? Is it likely he'll leave his wheelchair altogether? Well, no, it's not too likely. Is it likely that, you know, so people, even without feeling that the cure would be complete or that there would actually be any decrease in the care function, still have this propulsion, this enthusiasm for the research, but that doesn't necessarily translate into something about the care burden, at least when you talk to people. But there is a sense, at least among many women, that they stand to gain, that this is worth pursuing, if only because it's doing something, and that it might in significant ways improve qualities of life. And people can be immensely moving. I mean, it can be a small benefit in mobility, might improve my child's participation in social life, their potential to have a child later, to form a meaningful relationship, to succeed in their intellectual work. I mean, so the kinds of ways in which it might make a difference are just as wide and as moving as, you know, any interlocutor of any one of you would be in expressing their life goals. But there's also some ways in which women stand perhaps to be disproportionately left out of this, left out of the fruits of this research. And it's the main one of which in California is, well, there are two main ones. One is that there's a correlation between, between SES, between your income, of course mediated through your work situation, so whether or not you have insurance, and your likelihood to benefit from the fruits of this research. And if you combine that then with the thesis of the feminization of poverty, that's women-headed households and women in general, and in particular women of color, low-income women of color, that women are more likely to be, some women are more likely to be low-income than any other, especially women-headed families. You get a situation where you have a disproportionate burden of, or disproportionate restriction on access to the possible benefits of this research that has a gendered, race, class dynamic at its heart. Okay, so moving on to, so that's so women voted for and will fund through their tax dollars this research, despite the fact that it's unclear whether or not they'll have even a level playing field chance of benefiting from the fruits of the research. Okay, 2 times a woman. The second way in which women are called up, enrolled, asked to participate in this proposition disproportionately is that one of the raw materials of this research is women's eggs. So the text from the proposition itself reads Section 4, Article 35 is added to the California Constitution to read, there is hereby established a right to conduct stem cell research, which includes research involving adult stem cells, cord blood stem cells, pluripotent stem cells, and/or progenitor cells. Pluripotent stem cells are cells that are capable of self-renewal and have broad potential to differentiate into multiple adult cell types. Pluripotent stem cells may be derived from somatic cell nuclear transfer or from surplus products of in vitro fertilization treatments, when such products are donated under appropriate informed consent procedures. Now, there's an incredible amount going on in this paragraph, including an extraordinary amount of euphemism. I don't want to call it, well, let's just say euphemism. So where it says, you can see where it's bolded, where it says somatic cell nuclear transfer. That is a kind of cloning. It's what's otherwise known as research cloning, and it doesn't say anywhere there that what is at stake there is creating embryos in the lab by inducing with the raw material of women's eggs. But what it's in fact saying there is that it's okay to get eggs from women either before they're fertilized during in vitro fertilization or as an act of research donation itself. But the word egg, the word embryo, and the word woman never appear in this passage or anywhere in the proposition. The word cloning, although that's a kind of cloning, somatic cell nuclear transfer cloning is the normal name, or research cloning is a synonym, is never mentioned except in another section of the proposition where reproductive cloning is ruled to be illegal and unconstitutional, which is the idea of using these technologies to produce an identical, or as identical as it's possible to be now that we no longer think same genetics means same person, copy of oneself. The surplus products of in vitro fertilization, those products are embryos or eggs. Again and again, they avoid the use of the words eggs and embryos. You also don't see any mention of the women from whom the eggs come, or the couples, or the donors, or intended parent couples from whom the embryos come. So that all of those players in this, in what needs to be procured as raw material for the field, is just left out of the picture entirely. Nonetheless, so as I was saying before, the embryo politics became operationalized around the concept of acceptable derivation. But after the proposition passed, there was an outcry in California, and by many women's groups and other activist groups, and oddly enough, egg donor protection emerged as the women's issue in the aftermath of the passage of Proposition 71. The reason I say oddly enough is because California is a destination globally, and this is another topic I do research on, for transnational reproductive tourism. It's a destination for egg donation, and it's a relative regulatory oasis. There aren't that many restrictions, and certainly in the field of assisted reproductive technologies, we are not worried about the point is not to protect the egg donors. The point is to deride. When people are critical of the procedure, they tend to deride the eugenics of the procedure around assisted reproductive technologies, and they tend to deride the size of the payment that egg donors can get, the kinds of advertising, the ways of targeting college populations. How can you find people who have high cultural capital but low economic capital so that they're going to be good egg donors, and people have zeroed in on college campuses because college students are temporarily poor. They have a class status depression while they're in college, so they hit the sweet spot of being eugenically desirable while economically incentivizable to become egg donors. So the concerns that were already circulating in terms of critical concerns around egg donation in the fertility industry were very, very different here, where the concerns immediately became, for whom would this be bodily labor? For who is this likely to be bodily labor for? And the argument became, do we or don't we pay women for this work? And most women's activist groups and other activist groups came down in favor of not paying women, because if you paid for eggs, well, for two big reasons. If you pay for eggs, it's getting a little bit close to paying for babies. Not that we apply that to sperm donation, we don't, there's a big discrepancy. But it's getting a little bit close to the prohibitions we have on baby buying and selling, at least morally, if not actually. But also that you would be likely to have the result that the people who would be most likely to donate would be those for whom it would make most sense, it would be the most rational decision to undergo the risks of egg donation, which are the risks associated with hyperstimulation, with the gonadotropins, the fertility drugs that you take to make your ovaries produce lots of eggs. There are risks and healthcare risks associated with that, immediate and longer term possibly, although the data is poor, of undergoing those procedures. For whom is it rational? Is it a good decision in terms of caring for the self and caring for the family to relatively discount those risks? For those for whom the extra money would make an enormous difference in terms of quality of life for self and those one cares for. So there was a concern that the pool of egg donors for research, especially as there didn't seem to be the same eugenic pressure to move kind of up the class hierarchy, that it would differentially incentivize low-income women, and then in turn that would be racialized and all other kinds of patterns that we see across the state. There were many forays back and forth about what exactly whether anything ought to be done to incentivize egg donation at all, whether it should be you should get access to. If you donated your eggs, you might get medical care while you were donating your eggs. Maybe you and your family members, or you might get care for other conditions that you had, or routine medical screenings. And actually, people who have done studies, including myself, have done studies of donations and selling of body parts. There are a couple of motivations that are really, really kind of odd at first, but then make a great deal of sense when you think about them. One of which is that people like to be part of things that are high status. People like to be part of science. They like to be part of things where they have access to, they're in contact with people with cultural capital. They also like to have access and be in contact with the kind of fringe benefits of that, so the medical care and so on. So there's often, I found this in interviews with surrogates, for example, that the temporary class mobility that you get by having your body disciplined as the carrier of someone of a higher class than you, who is the intended parent who's commissioning your bodily labor, can for some women be a source of pleasure. It's a source of mobility in their own lives. And sometimes it has actual effects. And people have shown this too with research on surrogates in India, for example, that there are often very real benefits. So you get to stay in housing that's better than you might otherwise afford, and there might be bad impacts on you. You might get some kind of stigma that makes it hard for you to re-enter your family and social situation. But there can also be all kinds of benefits that your husband, by staying with you in that compound for surrogates, might get a job as a front desk person or in a low-level data entry thing and begin to edge up. So the contact with class mobility can be very meaningful. And where there is also transnational travel involved, the the pleasures as well as sometimes the actual migratory pressures to do with economic migration or fleeing a place with conflict or other kinds of stresses can also be something that's actively being sought. So this debate was raging about whether or not egg donors should be protected and how, and although the idea that egg donors among all kinds of bodily donors which are quite common and typically paid for, including egg donation for fertility treatment in the state, but these women suddenly should be protected, it was mocked as being paternalistic, maybe maternalistic on the one hand, and as being something that was itself differentially gendered. So how come we don't, the minute it's something that only women can give, we start saying, oh, we've got to be really careful and we can't pay any women and they wouldn't know how to discount, they wouldn't know how to take into account these risks. And so there were arguments on the other side as well as if you move it out of the realm of payment, if you move it into the realm of the gift economy, upon whom does the pressure then fall? And it disproportionately falls on people who care for, are themselves sufferers. So there were arguments as well from that side against the idea of making it entirely without compensation and in favour of, in some way, regularising it by moving it into contract form.